Standing in front of 80,000 fans at MetLife Stadium, Fat Joe felt his mind go completely blank for the first time in his 20-year career. The words to his biggest hit, "Mex," the song he had performed thousands of times, simply vanished from his memory. Dead silence filled the massive stadium as 80,000 people waited for him to continue, and millions more watched on live television. But this wasn't just stage fright. This was Fat Joe's deepest, most terrifying secret finally catching up with him. For years, he had been hiding a learning disability that made reading and memorizing nearly impossible. And tonight it was about to expose him as a fraud in front of the entire world. What happened in the next 5 minutes would either end his career in humiliation or transform him into something more powerful than he had ever been before. If you want to see how vulnerability can become strength and how facing your deepest fear can save not just your career but your soul, hit subscribe right now, because this story will change how you think about courage forever. July 15, 2012, MetLife Stadium, New Jersey. This wasn't just any concert for Fat Joe Phil, this was his 20-year career anniversary celebration, the biggest show of his life. Every major artist in hip-hop was there to honor his legacy. Every song in his catalog was scheduled to be performed, and the entire event was being broadcast live on MTV to celebrate 2 decades of his contributions to music and culture. But as Joey stood backstage preparing for his entrance, he was experiencing something that had haunted him since childhood. A panic attack triggered by his secret learning disability. Despite 20 years of performing, Joey had never learned to read music or lyrics fluently. Every song he had ever performed had been memorized through countless repetitions, muscle memory, and audio cues from his DJ. Tonight was different. Tonight there were special guests, unexpected song arrangements, and live television timing that disrupted all of his usual preparation routines. The teleprompters that usually helped him during TV appearances weren't positioned where he could see them, and the chaos of coordinating multiple artists meant his normal rehearsal time had been cut short. What Fat Joe had never told anyone was that he couldn't read at the level most people expected. Joey's learning disability, a combination of severe dyslexia and auditory processing disorder, had been diagnosed when he was 8 years old. But growing up in the South Bronx in the 1980s, learning disabilities were often seen as signs of laziness or stupidity, rather than legitimate medical conditions requiring accommodation and support. His teachers had labeled him a slow learner, and his peers had mocked his difficulties with reading aloud in class. By the time he was a teenager, Joey had developed elaborate strategies to hide his disability, including memorizing everything through repetition, relying on friends to read contracts and documents, and structuring his entire career around his strengths rather than his weaknesses. The irony was that his learning disability had actually contributed to his success as a rapper. His difficulty with traditional reading had forced him to develop exceptional auditory memory and an intuitive understanding of rhythm and flow. He could memorize complex rap verses faster than most people could read them, and his unique cognitive processing gave his music a distinctive style that couldn't be taught or imitated. But tonight, all of his coping mechanisms were failing. As Joey walked onto the MetLife Stadium stage to thunderous applause, he realized that the stress of the live television broadcast, the presence of 80,000 fans, and the disruption of his normal routine had triggered something he had never experienced before. A complete mental block that made accessing his memorized lyrics impossible. He started his first song, "Lean Back," confident that this familiar opening would get him back into his groove. But as he reached the first chorus, his mind went completely blank. The words that he had performed thousands of times simply weren't there. He stopped rapping and stood frozen on stage, staring at 80,000 expectant faces. The backing track continued playing, but Joey remained silent, experiencing the nightmare scenario that had terrified him for his entire career. All around him, guest artists and his own crew looked on in confusion and growing concern. This wasn't a technical malfunction or a forgotten lyric, this was something much more serious. In that moment of complete terror, something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking further or trying to fake his way through the performance, Joey made a decision that would change his life forever. He walked to the front of the stage, gestured for the music to stop, and spoke honestly to the 80,000 people staring at him and the millions watching on television. "Y'all, I gotta be real with you right now," Joey said, his voice carrying clearly through the massive stadium. "I'm standing here in front of all of you, and I just lost every word to every song I've ever written. But I want to tell you something I've never told anybody in 20 years of making music." The stadium fell completely silent. This wasn't part of any planned performance. This was something raw and unrehearsed happening in real time. I have a learning disability that makes reading and memorizing really difficult for me. I've been hiding it my whole career because I was ashamed, because I thought it made me weak, because I was afraid y'all would think I was stupid or fake. What Joey said next shocked everyone, including himself. But standing here right now, with my mind completely blank, I realized something. The thing I've been most afraid of my whole life, being exposed as someone who struggles with words, is also the thing that made me who I am. Because when you can't read lyrics off a page, you have to feel them in your soul. When you can't rely on traditional learning, you have to develop your own way of understanding the world. Joey began walking across the stage, speaking directly to different sections of the audience, as if he was having individual conversations with 80,000 people at once. How many of y'all have ever felt stupid because school was hard? How many of y'all have ever felt like you weren't smart enough, weren't good enough, weren't normal enough? Thousands of hands went up throughout the stadium. Well, I'm here to tell you something. Different doesn't mean deficient. Struggling doesn't mean stupid. And sometimes the thing you're most ashamed of is actually your biggest strength. At that moment, Joey began to freestyle in a way he had never done before. Instead of trying to remember scripted lyrics, Joey began creating new verses in real time, using his learning disability as the subject matter. He rapped about growing up ashamed of being different, about developing creative strategies to hide his struggles, about the fear of being discovered and rejected. But more importantly, he rapped about the gifts that came with his different way of processing the world, his enhanced auditory memory, his intuitive understanding of rhythm, his ability to connect with emotions rather than just words. Every bar was completely improvised, completely honest, completely from the heart. The audience responded with increasing enthusiasm as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A major artist using his most vulnerable moment to create his most powerful performance. What happened next transformed not just the concert, but Joey's entire relationship with his disability. Other artists who were scheduled to perform that night began joining Joey on stage, not to perform their planned songs, but to share their own stories of struggle and difference. A Grammy-winning singer revealed her battle with anxiety disorders. A legendary producer talked about growing up with a stutter that had initially prevented him from wanting to work in music. The planned anniversary concert became an impromptu celebration of neurodiversity, mental health awareness, and the power of turning personal struggles into artistic strength. MTV extended their broadcast time to capture what was becoming a historic moment in entertainment. Joey's freestyle performance, which lasted for over 30 minutes, was entirely unrehearsed, but more polished and powerful than anything he had ever recorded in a studio. When you removed the pressure to remember specific lyrics and allowed him to create in real time, his learning disability became an artistic advantage rather than a limitation. The impact of that night extended far beyond the concert itself. Video clips of Joey's honest revelation and freestyle performance went viral within hours, reaching hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The response wasn't mockery or disappointment. It was overwhelming support and inspiration from people who had never heard a successful public figure speak honestly about learning disabilities. Joey received thousands of messages from parents of children with learning disabilities, from adults who had been hiding their own struggles, and from educators who wanted to use his story to help students understand that different learning styles could be strengths rather than weaknesses. The concert footage became educational material used in schools across the country, showing students that success could come in many different forms and that traditional academic measures weren't the only indicators of intelligence or potential. Most importantly, Joey's relationship with his own disability was completely transformed. After 20 years of hiding and compensating for his learning differences, Joey began embracing them as integral parts of his artistic identity. He stopped using teleprompters and scripted performances, instead developing a more improvisational style that played to his strengths rather than working around his weaknesses. His subsequent albums featured more freestyle elements, more emotional honesty, and more experimental approaches to rhythm and wordplay. Critics noted that his music became more authentic and powerful after the MetLife Stadium performance, as if removing the pressure to hide his differences had freed him to be more creative. Joey also became an advocate for learning disability awareness, working with schools and organizations to help other people understand that neurodiversity could be a source of creative power rather than academic limitation. 5 years later, the MetLife Stadium performance was recognized as a turning point not just in Joey's career, but in public conversations about learning differences. The concert became case study material for psychologists, educators, and disability advocates who wanted to demonstrate how reframing differences as strengths could transform individual lives and societal attitudes. Joey established a foundation that provided scholarships and support for students with learning disabilities who were pursuing careers in creative fields, understanding that traditional educational paths might not work for everyone, but that alternative approaches could lead to extraordinary success. The freestyle performance from that night was eventually released as a single, with all proceeds going to learning disability research and support programs. It became one of Joey's most successful songs, not because it was technically perfect, but because it was emotionally honest. This is why Fat Joe's later career became so much more authentic and emotionally powerful. The night he faced his biggest fear and chose honesty over performance perfection taught him that vulnerability could be strength, and that the things we're most ashamed of might actually be our greatest gifts. His learning disability, which he had spent decades hiding, became the foundation for his most meaningful work and his most important message, that different doesn't mean deficient and that success can come from embracing who you really are, rather than pretending to be who you think people expect you to be. The MetLife Stadium performance also changed how the entertainment industry approached artists with learning differences and other disabilities. Record labels began providing better accommodations for artists who needed alternative rehearsal methods, and venues started incorporating accessibility features that went beyond physical disabilities. Joey's openness about his learning disability inspired a wave of similar revelations from other successful artists, athletes, and public figures who had been hiding their own struggles. This created a cultural shift that made it more acceptable for people in high-visibility careers to seek accommodations and support rather than suffering in silence. The foundation Joey established became a model for how successful people could use their platforms to support others facing similar challenges. Rather than just donating money, Joey provided mentorship, advocacy, and real opportunities for young people whose learning differences made traditional career paths difficult. Most importantly, Joey's story demonstrated that the qualities that make someone seem different or difficult in traditional educational settings might actually be the exact qualities that lead to extraordinary success in creative fields. His enhanced auditory memory, his intuitive understanding of rhythm, and his emotional intelligence were all connected to the same neurological differences that had made reading difficult. The freestyle performance from MetLife Stadium became legendary not just because it was musically impressive, but because it represented a moment when an artist chose authenticity over image management. In an industry where maintaining perfect public personas was often seen as essential to success, Joey proved that vulnerability and honesty could be even more powerful than manufactured perfection. Years later, when young artists asked Joey for advice about dealing with insecurities and fears about their abilities, he would always refer back to that night at MetLife Stadium. The moment you stop hiding who you really are is the moment you become who you're meant to be, he would tell them. Your biggest weakness might actually be your secret weapon. You just have to be brave enough to find out. The ripple effects of that performance continued for years, changing not just Joey's career but influencing how society understood and supported people with learning differences. It proved that one moment of courage and honesty could transform not just an individual life, but an entire cultural conversation about intelligence and success.